Christmas. For Advent, we joined in our voices with the theme being that the story is enough. The story that the children retold today and reminded of us. And not only are the stories of our faith and the stories of our lives enough, we need to remind ourselves that these stories are eternal, just as God is eternal. The stories can never be taken away. The experience cannot ever stop, and it continues to move us forward. But those who share stories, and those who hold the stories in their memories and their hearts, that actually can be taken. We've spent a lot of time talking about the roles of children and teenagers and even those in privileged situations. But we must also not forget the other storytellers that are an important part of our experience in faith. Those other storytellers are the ones that are also marginalized by society, especially in our American fast-paced society. They are the elderly, and even more accurately, those with disabilities. Those who force us in our world to slow down in our fast-paced society. In many cultures, historically, the elderly are seen as sacred. They are the holders of the stories. But that does not always seem to be the case in our marketing, high-paced world. Our society, I feel, often makes the elderly feel obsolete. Our technology, while it can be really helpful to those with mental and physical struggles, are not often used for helping others. Instead, they are used to make what is fast go faster and making what is slow feel even slower. And yet sometimes this technology can be helpful. There was a man in my church in California who was in and out of the hospital for lots of reasons. He was also far from his family, but he was an avid Facebook user in his 90s. He even once made them move him closer to the nurse's station so that he could have a faster Wi-Fi connection during his hospital stay. That way, during that time, while he was isolated and alone, he used social media to share his experience, his stories, and his life. He was the rare exception who kind of was able to connect in. Because so many people, whether you're elderly or not, still feel isolated and alone. And while they are full of stories and experiences, and many of them are stories of faith, they are stories that we haven't heard, stories we do not always know, and stories that may even help save us. I found this quote, which ironically is by Cameron Diaz, of all people. But it says, "They are our storytellers. Our elderly are meant to be those who share the secrets of wisdom and the knowledge and life with our youth." And so as we think about our storytellers and the importance of stories and the story being enough, I ask a question that we're going to wrestle with over the next few weeks. What is or are the stories that save? As we move from Jesus being a baby in a manger, to being a child, to being the man that we are going to come to know, and to move on to the story in its next phase, this is a really deep theological question. What are the stories that actually save us? Now, before we move into that question, I want us to slow down a bit. I want us to take some time on this, a New Year's Day and a new Sunday, to look at what has happened over the last year. It has been almost a full year since I've stood in front of you as this pulpit. And so what are the stories that save, being a big question, need to go back and look at the stories that have brought us to this point. So prior to Lent, a year ago, we spent time sharing stories. Stories of the church, universal, the denomination, and even stories of what it means to be independent Christian church. From these stories, we moved into the time of Lent and asked a big question of what makes a church a church. Ultimately, as we move towards Easter, we realize that the story of resurrection is the one that has the most power when living into what it means to be church. So during the Easter season, we started focusing on what it means to be transformed and renewed. We talked about what it looks like to be welcoming and loving, to be the true salt of the earth. And even during that time, there's lots of celebrations with Mother's Day and Earth Day as we move into Pentecost. And then we moved into summer, and we began to focus on the Bible and Bible study learning. We had 3 study worship services. And as we looked at those, we then preached based on some of the questions that came from that study. Primarily, the sermon time became a learning time, and the call to worship became trivia time. But together, we were able to realize that we need to know our biblical story. And there were also that moment of the summer study of remembering that our story isn't something we just do on Sundays. Our story is something that we live out and must experience every day in our lives, and to have the tools of which to do that. As we moved into the fall, we focused on celebrating and thankfulness and what it really means to live into the fact that we are a people of promise and what that promise looks like financially, spiritually, and daily. And then all of a sudden, a few weeks ago, the hanging of the greens, Advent, and the liturgical story and calendar as we know it began again. And here's the thing. A lot of times I hear elderly people in the church say, I've already done that, I'm tired. I have bad news for you as we talk about the importance of what it means to have stories that save. You need to remind yourself that no one gets to retire from God's work and call as a person of faith. You don't believe me, or you don't want to believe me? Well, let's look at the story of Anna and Simeon. Anna and Simeon were actually part of our summer Bible trivia, if you remember. And so often their story gets overlooked, even though they probably met Jesus before the Magi. But their story gets overlooked in a way that I feel like often our elderly get overlooked. And yet, I find that their story, Anna and Simeon, is probably one of the most powerful and profound when it comes to the birth of Jesus. It is a story that saves. It is a story that saves and even uses the words of salvation and redemption as they all of a sudden see this newborn child in the temple. It was their words that reminded and retaught the parents, Mary and Joseph, how profound their son Jesus was really going to be and how important his life could be. The temple is kind of what we, as Christians in our faith, would call church. It is part of the birth story, this movement from the stable to the temple. And the child's first adventure was not to Target or McDonald's. It was in the temple when Jesus was recognized as Jesus. In the temple, there were no angels, there were no big moments. There were these 2 people who had just been waiting here to let those around them know that this baby was blessed. That this baby was a baby that was going to come forth and show the world that there was a Savior. This child would be the one to save. But it was the elders without angels, without stars in the sky, without all of these other things that are part of this miraculous story. It was the elders who just knew that there was a child who had spirit and word. Even as our children have spirit and word. That is the job of all of us, especially our elders, to remind all of us to be recognized in the spirit of worth of those who are younger in this place. To remind us of the stories that save and that there are some things that are worth slowing down and waiting for. Now, my job as your pastor in a middle generation somewhere is to help equip all of us on ways to communicate so that the younger people that you want to reach out and help will actually be able to hear you and listen to you. And so that they can actually know your stories and know their own work in a way that only the elderly can truly impart to us. And one of the ways that we are continuously saved by Jesus and the stories that we have now seen about the birth of this Christ child is that there are multi-level relationships. Relationships for all levels, from the Christ child to the Anna and Simeons, to the Marys and Josephs, to the Magi, to the shepherds, where all of these people are a part of the story. And the story together are multi-level relationships. It's much more powerful. It includes moments of miracles, but it also includes the miracle of those people who have lived into this story so long, like Anna and Simeon, that they just know the Christ child when they see him. The story continues to be enough. And the stories in all their forms have the potential to have a saving, redemptive power. But we can only see the stories for their depth and their beauty when we recognize that we are all worthy, we are all enough, and we are all a part of this story. We can help bring salvation and redemption to a world that needs to know the Christ child and the adult he will become, when only we recognize that within us and around us, from the youngest to the oldest, there are stories in which God has been working to save all of us. So what is it? What are the stories that save us? Lots of them. And over the next few weeks, we will talk more about how we are saved and what it means for Jesus to be the one to guide that saving. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.